Free markets and human freedom are related, but they are not the same. Free markets are a component of human freedom, but they are not the whole of human freedom. In my opinion, and I think history bears me out, you cannot have a free society without having a very large role for the free market, without having the bulk of resources in that society, or the majority of resources in that society, being organized through a free market. But on the other hand, you can have a society which is largely controlled by a free market, in which the bulk of resources are organized through a free market, but which is not a free society. The most obvious current example is the case of Chile. There is no doubt that if you judge Chile solely in terms of the role which is played by free markets have at least as large a role to play in Chile as they do in the United States, if not a larger role. Their international trade is probably less restricted than our international trade. Their domestic trade is probably less restricted. And yet, by no conceivable definition would you call Chile a free society. It is a society in which you have a military dictatorship which is running it, which is restricting human rights and human liberties and human freedom. And yet, it does have a very largely free market. I grant you that that is not the usual course of events, but it is a possible course of events. And that's why it seems to me so important to have a broader construct, to think of freedom as encompassing much more than what are narrowly regarded as market arrangements. It encompasses the whole of human activity and the whole of the interpersonal relationships among people. There is a great deal of confusion about what you mean when you talk about freedom. It's very easy and very tempting to confuse freedom, as I use the word, or as I think you people would want to use the word, with wealth or power. Compare, for example, a citizen of the United States today and a citizen of the United States 100 years ago. There is no doubt that the citizen of the United States today has much more wealth on the average than the citizen 100 years ago. If, as some people do, you define freedom in terms of the range of alternatives available to a person, among which that person can choose, then you would have to say that people today are freer than they were 100 years ago. They have a much wider range of alternatives. But that is not a very useful definition of freedom because it confuses two very different things. Robinson Crusoe on an island by himself might be on a very rich island, and there might be a neighborhood Robinson Crusoe all by himself on a poor island. The Robinson Crusoe on a rich island would have a wider range of choices. He would have more alternatives open to him. The Robinson Crusoe on the poor island would have fewer. But there'd be no meaning to saying that one Robinson Crusoe is freer than the other. He's wealthier than the other, but he's not freer. And in the same way, as I shall develop more fully in a few minutes, the citizen of the United States today is wealthier than his counterpart 100 years ago, but he is by every dimension less free than he was 100 years ago. In the same way, in any individual society, a person who has a high income has a wider range of alternatives open to him than a person who has a low income. But are you going to say he's freer? No, he's wealthier. He may be more or less free. That depends on what? It depends on the extent to which he is subject to the coercion of other people. I define freedom, for my purposes, as referring to relations among people and as referring to the absence of coercion by other persons. And by coercion, I mean physical coercion or the threat thereof. I don't mean coercion through being a better arguer or through having more money with which to bid you away. I mean coercion by hitting you over the head or its equivalent. Now, there is, of course, no such thing as absolute freedom, In the famous phrase of a Supreme Court justice, my freedom to move my fist is limited by the proximity of your jaw. So that all freedoms are limited, and the limit is that a free society is one in which people are free to make any arrangements they want between themselves, so long as two conditions are satisfied. The first is that it's voluntary, and the second is that it does not affect, more particularly harm, third parties. See, we've got competition up here. Sabotage, yes. There must be a modern liberal as opposed to a classical liberal somewhere around. Now, if we're going to talk about the future of freedom, as Santayana's famous cliche tells us, we can best judge the future by looking at the past. And the past, if you look at it objectively and broadly, gives very little reason, in the first instance, for any optimism about the future of freedom. If you look at the history of the world over long periods of time, it's perfectly clear that the natural state of mankind is tyranny and misery. That free societies have been very rare, there have been very few of them, they've been very exceptional. It's hard to find any place in the world where you have had a free society over any long period of time, and at no time have more than a minority of the people ever lived in a free society. That's as true today as it has ever been before. We have been extraordinarily fortunate in having been born or having been able to migrate to a relatively free society. As I say, as I shall point out, less free than it was, but certainly free by comparison with most of the countries of the world. And therefore we tend to underestimate the fragility of a free society and the difficulty of maintaining it. We think of the it's not only that free societies have been rare, but they have been largely a result of accident rather than of any natural, predetermined forces. There is no natural force that leads to freedom. I have often thought that, using economic analogies, that it may well be that a free society is an unstable equilibrium position. A position which it can be, if achieved, can be maintained, but which, if slightly disturbed, will tend to move toward its opposite. I hope that's not right, and I think it need not be right, but it's not something that history lets us dismiss.